Alright, the last season was pretty good for anime. Like, really quite good. Out of the big hitters though, Dungeon Meshi or Delicious in Dungeon might be the hardest to get into. It doesn't have the gut punch opening of Freerun. The fan service is unconventional. It needs a bit of time to hook you in. Once it does get its claws stuck in there though, you'll find Dungeon Meshi is a rich and complex anime with well-painted characters, a layered world, and a payoff to anything that's set up in the earlier parts of the season. On the surface, Dungeon Meshi is about cooking. But don't get it wrong, it's far from cooking mama in a dungeon.
I love cooking mama.
It's a slow start, but by the end, Dungeon Meshi is a lot deeper than it first seems. It starts slow. You need that space though, you need that time with the characters, with the world, with Marcille's many reaction faces. You need to let them seep, like brewing coffee or making food, as would be the better tortured metaphor for a series with the hook of cooking in a dungeon. It literally needs the space to cook. The light episodes that start us off, well, light if we're ignoring the party wipe at the very opening, they feel like they're just about cooking, but they're completely needed for the character and world building. The show snowballs over time, growing into something incredible, kind of like bringing things together when you are cooking. Raw ingredients often aren't anything special. You've got an onion here and a grizzled half-man there. With the right ingredients, time, and the methods to explore them properly, it starts to take shape. Yeah, it's slow at the beginning, but nearly all of the entire first half gets paid off later. It can feel like you're in for something light, breezy. But as you go on, even throwaway jokes are coming back as character-relevant moments. At the start, you've just got raw ingredients. But as you take time to prepare everything, it'll all pay off with something delicious in the end. And the further into the season that we get, the richer the depths of Dungeon Meshi are. Plus, there's this guy, he's pretty cool, isn't he?
Well, did you want to show me anything?
Alright, yeah, what about that?
What? The ant?
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of cool, but it doesn't make me feel any better, though.
Yeah, no, I didn't think so. Okay.
That first half putting in the legwork pays off, especially in its character work. As we move through the early episodes, it all builds like flavours diffusing into a soup or sauce. The more they're cooked, the greater the payoff. For example, as Laios is investigating living armour, we get a few things. It's a great bit of world building for a start, a really unique approach to the monsters. It builds the idea that there's some rules to this dungeon, a logic. It's not just magic on armour, but a hive mind of monsters that happen to look like that. It's an episode that builds the world and even introduces a major character in the cowardly sword that Laios picks up. That cowardly sword, by the way, goes on to be the best girl. So, if you disagree with me, don't put anything in the comments. I'm right. I already know I'm right. But even in an episode doing all of this, our characters are cooking. Chilchuk gets space to shine, we get Laios and his party in a challenging fight. There are hints at a deeper background to this dungeon, plus we get characterization on everyone here. It's a solid story that lets us into the world and tells us something about everyone in the party and how they relate to each other, and even the dungeon we're exploring wall. It's work, building these people up, making the viewer get a proper sense of them to the point that they seem to live outside the world of what you're watching. The work pays off though. Once that soup or sauce is done, you get to eat it. The character work builds the base and adds the flavour before we get to enjoy the payoff. Some of this payoff is in the big moments like the Red Dragon fight, but there's more. One of the most interesting demonstrations of how much that character work has paid off comes in episode 18, where shapeshifters take the form of the party and we have to tell the real from the fake. One of the few cases of loss of individuality in the dungeon, but we'll get to that. Of course, there's more complexity to this, as there seems to be with any general monster in Dungeon Meshi. Everyone's double is based on someone else's image of them in their heads. We get to see what Marcille thinks of Laios, Chilichuk of Marcille, etc. These are pretty fun. The image of each other only exists in another party member's mind. They come to life. These work because by this point the viewer has such a strong image of the character in their own mind. Some people's impressions might even match one of these facsimiles. Maybe this is how speed watchers actually see the screen. The Laios ones are especially fun, but at least this shows he has some object permanence. He can tell you're a person, that you're there, even if you're not quite a monster and aren't as important. Each of these characters is a physical manifestation of the relationship between each party member. The payoffs to this little Guess Who section works better because of how well we know them. It highlights the characters and their interplay, which is so well defined by this point that a gimmick like this can actually work. By focusing on the core party, we can build these relationships to the point where an episode like this makes sense. It feels realistic for them to have these ideas and impressions of each other, but then knowing, viewers can likely spot whose image of who each is pretty quickly. Because we've been made to understand how the characters see each other so much better. Having the characters pushed into cooperation with another party later on in the story is interesting too. Once we've gotten to know our core cast, we're introduced to an alternative batch of adventurers, just to make it clear what we've gotten used to. The journey so far has been underpinned by them breaking a pretty big taboo in that lifestyle. Then we get a probably even bigger taboo being broken and creating the whole demon chicken thing. While we're used to it, these other characters' reactions to the party who feasts on the flesh of the vanquished and uses black magic however they please and resurrects dragons that terrorized everyone. It puts back into focus how odd the whole thing has been, what the viewer has exactly been rooting for. Some of the payoff in the second half of Dungeon Meshi actively weaponizes how strong the characters have become by that point. The journey back into the dungeon that opens this anime is made different by the addition of one party member, Senshi. Well, the loss of a ton of people first, but Senshi joining makes up for all of it. He's an elf with a passion for cooking up monsters, and seemingly a real creature of the dungeon's ecosystem, compared to those that we just see dipping in and out for work, like the Uber Eats delivery drivers in the McDonald's. We learn more about Senshi throughout the series, but the most impactful details to explain why he is the way that he is come in episode 23. Here we get a full flashback of how Senshi came to be in the dungeon, and so much about him just falls into place. In the past 20 episodes, we've seen that Senshi's cooking goes beyond wanting to be helpful. He has a need to use his skills to care for others, and we find out why. Senshi's group was one of the first to enter the dungeon, making it pretty far in before being cornered by what they believe to be a griffin. Gradually, things deteriorate, and it evolves into a lifeboat in the ocean kind of a situation. Tensions are high and the dwarfs are being picked off or supplies dwindle. Senshi is a source of anger to some of his party. The leader of his group prioritizes feeding the youth despite how little help he is. By the end of the flashback, the other dwarfs are gone, and for decades, Senshi has been unsure if he ate monster flesh or if his party had to get even more desperate to survive. Something we know must have weighed on him all this time. Way back episode 7, he even names the kelp horse after the horse in this flashback. Something this traumatic can recontextualize Senshi's obsession with dungeon living and its ecosystem. The dwarf in the modern day is still haunted by the incident, but he has managed to reframe the dungeon as something he can now coexist with. He knows how to sustain himself in a dungeon better than anyone. He's been working on that flaw that got them into that situation ever since, coming to respect the dungeon's life. The whole thing reads like a way of coping with the trauma of what's happened to him that's turned into a lifestyle. Lack of skills that led to that desperate situation, they now can't happen again, thanks to his obsession with learning how to live within the dungeon. It also specifically reframes his calls to feed the little ones and look after them in the past. Just like the party leader did, he insists on feeding them, the young ones. Although Senshi's young one is a middle-aged man with children. When we learn about his background, so much of Senshi's behaviour earlier seems much more impactful. It's demonstrating more about his character. While Senshi has made himself much more competent in the cooking department, he's still not the biggest help in a fight, like in episode 17 where he's holding a tray of food for the entire skirmish. He has a shield that's near indestructible, but he just uses it to cook. Same for the traps in the dungeon. Senshi takes what should be the objects of fear to him and the threatening monsters and life in the dungeon, and he uses it to create food, the things needed to sustain life in the first place. What at one point feels like the throwaway lines and little jokes, goes on to be a major motivator and character moment for Senshi. By taming the human necessities like hunger, he's become a part of the dungeon's ecosystem. By pushing past another so-called griffin encounter and finally putting the dilemma of the meat to rest, he's able to move on. There's a reason for Senshi's food enthusiasm, beyond that it would be funny in the moment, but the payoff works so well because of all that time getting to know him earlier. A lot has already been said about Laios's special interests and bluntness and symptoms, but Laos's character throughout has hidden depths. One perfect Laos moment comes when Senshi has told him his harrowing flashback. Laos quite bluntly suggests just eating the griffin so he knows for certain. It's a little insensitive, it's pretty fucking insensitive, but it's also exactly what he needs to hear. Laos has a tendency to space out, ignoring the detail and just bluntly tackling a problem, but often these moments seem to work out for him. He says something a bit blunt or simple-minded that drags the conversation back to his monster's obsession. The shocked expression from the dwarf meat story is pretty symbolic of this. He might not have tact, but he's doing a pretty good job in his role in the party. We gradually see that Laos, for all of his Cloud Cuckoo Lander tendencies, is much more committed to restoring his sister than he seems. He views his role in the party as requiring some leadership, being a bit more casual about it though, like the wolf he seems to envision himself as. I love that, by the way, that Laos would definitely be one of those guys with a wardrobe full of wolf t-shirts. His easygoing approach works perfectly for assuming the active role in the party. When we see Laios approach the problem of his sister turning into an evil chicken, dragon, devil monster, he immediately starts to think of practical solutions. No time to dread over it. Once he gets the idea, he's quickly measuring the practicalities of if it's physically possible to even eat all of that dragon meat. Not if they should, but how it can be done. We can read this as him missing the forest for the trees, yeah, or maybe he's just moved on so fast that the practical solution must be made to work. If it's the only way to do it, then Laios isn't going to waste time in shock. He's moving the party onto the physical practicalities of getting it done. Laios is effective. But yeah, he does love eating monsters and monsters in general, and he has some wacky ideas, like legitimately considering this for his monster sister. He's even genuinely impressed in a way by Farlin becoming part monster. Laios can't really read emotions all that well, or just doesn't care enough about babying people in the more rough and tumble landscape of the dungeon. We see in flashback that this adventurous life is something that he's always craved. He's at home in the dungeon. It's what he's interested in, and it's where he thrives. Laios seems to have a firm idea of what he's good at, and he's not afraid to dedicate himself to it entirely. Throughout, Laos's obsessions and slight rudeness can hide the depth that he's a very capable leader of his party who doesn't hesitate, especially in the dungeon. He's at home in this space. That this leads to outsiders viewing Laios as up to something. His earnestness is unbelievable, though with an ulterior motive. Once Laios' deeper conviction and strengths are revealed like this, it makes perfect sense why the guy who can't stop talking about monsters might be viewed as the best person to finish the dungeon and take the crown. A plot point early on, and it comes back up throughout, is that the party isn't ideal, even though it pretty much matches the ideal party shape in the media that inspired Dungeon Meshi. It's smaller than when they last faced the Red Dragon, and at times it feels like they're missing something. That's especially the case early on, where Marcille feels kind of ineffective and like not everyone has had a chance to shine yet. The pacing and slower early approach means we quickly get blanks filled in though. And of course, since our protagonist group is smaller, optimal or not, it's going to work for most of our journey. That we get dedicated episodes of Chilchuk proving his skills even if he's poor in a fight. Marcille can do banned black magic, which is always helpful. Laios' talents, which are shown off early. The obvious utility of Senshi is present throughout as someone who eliminates the need for supplies. It seems this approach to travelling the dungeon might be what everyone else has been missing. Then later on we get a cat girl in the party because there was one hole that still needed filling. The party's just big enough to keep the dynamics between them manageable, and the later edition comes far enough in that we already know the characters well enough to just throw another one in, just throw her in there in the mix, it's fine. Marcille is often a ball of anxiety. She's a reaction machine, loads of different hairstyles, tons of great faces. Her name is clearly Italian for all that's worth. Is there anything more there though, anything deeper? Marcille is an elf who's never quite at home, coming partially from humans stuck on a faster track. She's fascinated by dungeons and their ecosystems, but rather than working with the elves as we see later, she's in this ragtag party. Why does she fit in better here? She's someone who doesn't seem to be the best fit in Lass's party at first, at least when they're happily chomping down on a cheeky bit of monster every day. The more we learn about her though, the more we see why why she belongs here. Marcille might jump at half the strategies that are suggested, but Laios appears to know her well enough to know that he doesn't need to take her panic all that seriously. She even adjusts to eating monsters, eventually. On the surface, she's a bit difficult for the party, but we quickly see how her heightened passion and tendency to overreact a bit fits in. It's a pretty necessary counter to Laios' easygoing chill, and who else is going to break laws of nature with their magic? One link between Marcille and Senshi is her attempts to tame dungeons as an ecosystem. Both have an interest in the dungeon beyond a source of employment. Along with Laios' desire to know monsters and potentially even claim the kingdom, they're all almost trying to tame it, to harness it for their own use, although each character has their own approach to that and they're pretty different, like Senshi's more respectful approach. Marcille's morality can be pretty complex in places too. She won't eat monsters, she will do black magic that's banned from polite society. Her priorities are easy to understand though. As we see her background and the basis of her and Farlin's relationship, we can see why she's willing to do the more severe in aid of getting her back. The turning point comes at the midpoint of the first series. The Red Dragon fight feels like the climax to our initial story. The getting to know everyone's side of the story. It's here where all our ingredients are chopped and prepped, those characters grown and the world built. And now we can start to reap the rewards. The moment in the aftermath that really shook me is a fantastic shot that I'm sure most viewers remember, as Laios finds what's left of his sister. The entire fight is fantastic, like using creativity and everyone's unique talents that we've seen so far to take down the dragon, and then resurrect it as something potentially worse. Farlin's short comeback brings us once again directly into contact with the lunatic magician, or as Laios might know him, that guy from the paintings. It's another early episode that feels throwaway but becomes vital. What befalls Farlin is a complete loss of identity. First in death, despite death being less permanent in the dungeon, only to glimpse life back before losing it again. There's an inhumanity to Farlin's new form and a further loss of agency to her experience, especially being controlled by the magician so directly. It's a loss of identity that the rest of the cast eventually ends up getting a slight taste of as they change species with the change mushrooms. Alright, so turning from tall guy to half man isn't quite the same as becoming a kind of half harpy eldritch horror, but it's a fundamental shift in how you perceive yourself. Only Farlin might be losing the ability to perceive herself at all. The mushroom transformation is a smaller, nicer taste of a monster transformation. It's even lampshaded by the party reasoning maybe this process could turn her back one day. The lunatic magician has a habit of stripping away elements of humanity, as we can see in the preserved village and their loss of taste. Farlin is this taken to the extreme. At the core of Dungeon Meshi is the dungeon itself. More than just an element ripped from video games for characters to level up in, the dungeon here is a living, breathing ecosystem. The dungeon itself is at the heart of storytelling here. The title in English is Delicious in Dungeon to maintain the double meaning. They're cooking in the dungeon, but adventurers are also food for the dungeon. The dungeon is evolving, it's thinking, the whole place is much more thought out than just a backdrop. It's also heavily linked to food and cooking. Food is the core mechanic, it buffs, it limits most parties' time here. It's taming this aspect that gives our party such an advantage. The depth of the dungeon is seen throughout, like the living armor that isn't just magic. It's a creature with a reason to be. We see these turns to explain away fantasy monsters throughout, like the detail put into the change mushrooms reproducing later, or the tomato sheep hybrid thing. It's not enough that they drive a plot, they have to make sense too. It's all seems to add up. The dungeon is a self-contained little world with its own hierarchy. Senshi and Marcille particularly pick up on it. It's a self-sustaining economy to those who know how to take advantage of it. An ecosystem with diverse life, but entirely controlled by a single lunatic magician. Dungeon Meshi makes this heft and depth to the concept of a dungeon part of its core premise. They are dungeon food. One thing that I've heard in criticism of the show is that it's not sure of its identity or what it wants to be, which honestly I just don't get. To me, that feels like one of its strengths in its development. Dungeon Meshi starts a little lighter, we get to know the characters, we get world building along the way. Then that all starts to pay off, all that building begins to reveal itself as a rich world, well thought out, with characters that are well rounded and they seem to live when they're not on the screen. It has to get some of that hard work out of the way with the setup though, and it does that through having a slightly different tone earlier on. Trying to fit this into an overly square hole is silly. An anime can have fantastic world building and lighter jokes, or even a twice weekly cooking segment. All those lighter aspects can be covertly building up the characters and the world. Meshi is making something. It might not immediately grab you, but this is potentially a reason why the 3-episode rule isn't always the best. I'm not going to sit here and advocate making it a 12-episode rule, I mean, I have things to do. But Meshi is good enough to grab in 3. It's not the way the story's ingredients come together later that makes it special, that's what elevates it. For the first few episodes it's fun, but you might not get the hype. It's a show that needs time to ramp up, so that its payoff can be all the better. It needs time to cook. Hey, if you made it all the way through this overly long video, you may as well subscribe. Or don't, I'm just the outro. Thanks to everyone who has so far, I'm quite new at this and I appreciate it. Cheers.